Hello there, guys. I'm Randy, and today we're going to be talking about one of the most influential periods of Chinese history, and also one of the hardest to live through. The Taiping Rebellion was one of the most bloody wars in world history, lasting from 1850 to 1864. In this time, more than 20 million people were estimated to have died directly as a result of the war, which, to give it some comparison, is 10 times the casualty rate of the American Civil War. That 20 million estimate doesn't even include the millions that returned home wounded and with nothing. The Taiping Rebellion wasn't even the only internal fighting going on at this time, as across China, groups struggled for rights and change. The Nine Rebellion, which actually collaborated numerous times with the Taiping Rebellion, was ravaging northern China. These rebellions weren't just to overthrow the Qing leadership, but rather to change the way of life in China. After the involvement of colonial powers into the Chinese cities and country after the First Opium War, the Qing government had made life extremely difficult for the people of China, especially those in the south and rural communities. This is the way of life Hong Jiquan found himself when he was a young man. Even starting as a young man, Hong lived in an extremely rigid social structure which existed during the time in China. Despite being one of the majority ethnic group of the day, Han Chinese, and seen as a super intelligent in his own community, he still couldn't make headway in advancing himself in the Qing examination system. Here we can start to see some of the base for his eventual contempt for Qing China and the Manchus who were leading it. Several times Hong took the Qing examinations and failed. And to give some context, the failing of an examination was detrimental because it was the only way people could get into government and therefore higher prestige jobs. If someone failed like Hong did, then they would expect no advancement, no matter how hard they tried. Failing these examinations for Hong just reinforced the fact that advancing was too difficult in the way of life they lived. He was eventually able to find a job, though, as a local schoolmaster, and was ready to live a normal life. Until, of course, he started to have his famous visions. At first, he couldn't explain these visions or why he was having them even. This is where one of the most important groups to Hong came into his life. The Protestant missionaries helped him find the answers to what the visions meant. This was actually because of a random pamphlet he was given while in college, one that he set aside immediately as it wasn't any interest to him at the time. This pamphlet was one by Lang Fa, a Chinese Protestant who actually helped establish the first few generations of Protestant missionaries in China. Fa was an officially ordained Protestant, and his pamphlets were a massive influence on Hong, because one of the key concepts was about reading the Bible. Hong's reading of the Bible made him believe that the Qing had made a group of fake gods to overshadow the real God. Hong's conversion was significant because it was happening during a very difficult time for young people and Christians especially. China being ruled by the very small minority of Manchus angered most of the Han Chinese, but Hong was also part of a subgroup of Han Chinese known as the Hakka. This group was one of the most victimized, and they saw firsthand other subgroups like the Cantonese thrive under the Manchu rule. The Cantonese thrived because they received favorable trade treatment, and the Hakka didn't. This was furthered by the fact that young men were very angry at the system because they saw no future for advancement, and the Hakka class saw in Hong somebody who might change the way the Manchus and Cantonese treated them. Hong, for his part, saw the Manchus as literal demons and mortal enemies of the Chinese. His beliefs now morphed into hatred as he believed that the Hakka should take over. Hong wanted to end the preferable treatment to the Cantonese, and he wanted the Manchus gone. His beliefs moved further when the purging and the persecution against Christians became more frequent. This set off many of Hong's followers, and by 1851, the Qing had had enough of this rebellious group. What came as a surprise to the Qing, though, was that their attack on Hong's followers in 1851 failed. The Taiping, as they would become known, defeated the Qing attack, and thus the rebellion-civil war began. The beginning of the Taiping Rebellion and the early movement of Hong resulted in the foundation of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, with Hong declared as a leader and a new future shown to the poor people of the South. Many new followers joined. These followers were intellectuals, women, children, poor, and many groups of marginalized people. And although it's easy to assume that Hong was responsible for its dramatic growth, he wasn't the only person in charge. He did work on a large scale behind the scenes, and he did order many proclamations, but in a matter-of-fact sense he was a puppet leader. Much of the real power laid in the hands of generals of different areas, especially Yang Jiqing, the Eastern King. The one area that Hong did have a lot of power, though, was in the ideals and ways of life. Being the spiritual leader as he was, and the one who had the visions, he knew what he expected out of the people in the heavenly kingdom. The heavenly kingdom was an expansive, rural, and warm place to live, but it was also an extremely strict place to live, with punishments in many different areas that would not have been in place in the traditional Qing Empire. This included opium, slavery, gambling, all being illegal and banned due to their natures of corrupting a society. The strict rules didn't end at those things, though, because even marriages were split, with men and women being completely separated during the night. Even married couples had to sleep apart. Despite these stricter rules, though, the society was one well beyond its years. Hong had made the heavenly kingdom a place of prosperity and equality. Men and women were considered equal in every aspect of life, including in the practice of allowing women to serve with men in the armies, in which service was always expected. Another forward-thinking idea of Hong's was his proclamation of no private property, as it was all supposed to be given to the heavenly leader to disperse to all equally. This is something that we wouldn't see for another 70 years elsewhere. Hong believed that this was necessary because of his interpretation of Acts 4:42 through 35, in which everything was laid at the feet of the apostles, and they were supposed to distribute it all evenly. The heavenly kingdom also pursued social reform and land reform, making everyone in the society equal in economic terms and social terms as well as decision-making terms. One of the major ways they tried to put everyone on the same level was by using the words brother and sister, which was considered radical in Chinese society because they did so for each person was family to one another. There was no real level of differences because they were all the same. The most important rules for the heavenly kingdom laid in one of the most important documents, that being the Ten Commandments, also known as the Ode to Youth, which covers a multitude of different areas, specifically focusing on honoring God and no other spirits. It was also focused on the fact that we are all created by God, making us equal from the start. It also included the ideas of filial piety, duties of mothers, brothers, sisters, fathers, etc. It even encouraged the following of one man who was to lead the world to peace. Obviously, for them, it was Hong. While all this early founding work was going on, the generals were successful in their conquering of territory, specifically as they were capturing and then setting up base in Nanjing around the year 1853, which they eventually declared the heavenly capital. As the early stages of the rebellion shifted into the middle to later stages of Taiping history, the Taiping generals continued to keep on the offensive. This included several expeditions which were met with differing levels of force. The two most important expeditions were those of the North and the West, with the North resulting in failure and the Western expedition resulting in unlimited success. These failed/unsuccessful expeditions were joined with Hong's displeasure at Yang Jiqing, who he believed to be getting out of control. Yang had been one of the original joiners in the Taiping movement and had been rewarded by being put in charge of the army and being called the Eastern King. Yang didn't like that Hong was getting all the attention, so he started to imitate Hong by also acting as a mouthpiece of God. Hong decided that with this challenge to his authority, the best way to take care of him was to send the other generals after him. As they didn't, then Yang would surely take control. This would later become known as the Tianjin Incident, which involved Yang against the other generals of the Heavenly Kingdom. This massive battle resulted in 27,000 Taiping soldiers and civilian lives being lost, along with an even more damaging rift in the Taiping movement. From a military standpoint, this was a major turning point, because the Taiping could not afford to be battling each other when the Qing was at their doorstep. This was also created a shift in how Hong ran the military aspects of the Heavenly Kingdom, because rather than having generals chosen by their merits, he switched to those who were most loyal to him. This naturally backfired because he no longer had the most qualified generals be in charge, just the ones who would say yes to his commands. With Yang out of the way, other generals then started to reach out to Europe and the West for support. Unfortunately for the Heavenly Kingdom, not only was this unsuccessful, but it in fact backfired in a way they could not have predicted. The Western powers actually began to support the Qing, because even though the Taiping were Christian like themselves, many of the Western Christians saw the Heavenly Kingdom as a heresy. Not only was the movement a little too radical for the Europeans and Westerners, but the idea of Hong being the younger brother of Jesus Christ was well beyond anything that the Westerners were going to accept. The Europeans also were disgusted by what they perceived as Hong's unchristian way of life. Not only was he sleeping with many different women and living a very different life than the one he preached about, but he was also brutally murdering many of the people that didn't follow his ways. All this led to the European backing of the Qing, which truly started to hurt the Taiping movement. As the tides turned in the late 1850s, the Taiping for the first time started to lose land. The Qing started advancing rapidly, and it was helped by Hong's own threatening moves. Hong scared away many of his own allies, including one of the biggest armies under their control, led by General Shi Dekai. The internal fights caused by many of the helpful programs of the Taiping were to be forgotten. This caused many of the citizens and civilians living inside the Heavenly Kingdom to start up resistance efforts. Locals from across the Taiping area began creating armies and militias because they wanted to return to the Confucian values of older times. The Qing Empire took advantage of this and forged an unlikely alliance with the new warlords and militia group. For a short period of time, though, 1859 to 1862, there was a shift back in favor of the Taiping when Hong Rengan started to take over control of the military. Rengan was the cousin of Hong Zhiquang, and so there was a strong bond between them. By 1859, Rengan was the most powerful figure in the Taiping movement, and his goal of expanding the boundaries of the Taiping were successful for a time. Rengan was actually the original general who captured Nanjing in 1853, and he used many of the same tactics in 1861 when he led several successful campaigns against Jingzhou, Xinjiang, Hangzhou, and Changzhou. His territorial gains came to a stop, though, at Shanghai. After many failed attempts and even the rejoining of Shi Daikai's forces to assist in the attack, the Qing eventually stopped the Taiping forces. The over-focus of resources and men on Shanghai eventually led to an overcommitment. The British and French also saw this as a threatening move because both had bases in Shanghai. To counteract the Taiping focus, the foreigners started arming the Qing with modern weapons to end the Taiping rebellion. By 1864, the Qing once again re-established control over much of the formerly lost territory. And to make sure the Taiping didn't rise up again in those areas, the Qing abandoned all military rules and decided to implement a scorched earth policy by destroying everything in its wake. By the end, nearly 600 cities were wiped out. As the Taiping forces fell back to their capital of Nanjing, the Qing marched on. As the forces laid in wait outside the city, the people in the city ran low on supplies. This resulted in raw food being eaten. Unfortunately for Hong, some of the fruit that was brought to him actually gave him food poisoning, which resulted in his death. Although, of course, some say he actually committed suicide, or even others suggest he might have been killed by some of his generals. For that, we will never know for sure. Shortly after his death, though, Nanjing fell and the movement fell apart. When the Qing entered the city, they slaughtered thousands of people, destroyed the city, followed by the execution of all political prisoners. Although the fall of Nanjing was in 1864, and the movement mostly ended by that time, the commitment of many was so strong that it took until 1871 for the Qing to finally destroy all the several hundred thousand Taiping forces that were still willing to fight. The Taiping rebellion alone had killed nearly 20 to 30 million, and some historians claim closer to 50 million. This affected China in many different ways, the first being it was economically and militarily weakened. The Qing didn't really have the necessary resources or equipment to do the war that was needed, and so the help from Europeans and Westerners came as a double-edged sword. The Qing needed them, but now they owed them millions and had no likely way of paying them back. The Westerners also re-entered China and put even more pressure on the Qing to do what they had to say. In the eyes of the Chinese people, this made China look worse, and it put Westerners back into China. But the real question lies in why does this rebellion matter? What effect did it have on future China and future generations? First, it's good to look, even during the time of the Civil War itself, the Taiping movement had far-reaching influence, as even Karl Marx was shaped by the events that took place in China. He saw some of the ways the movement had succeeded, but he also saw how the movement had come up short. This allowed him even to revise some of his own theories. One of the most important aspects of its effects can be seen in the revolutionaries that followed, the most important being Mao Zedong, who saw Hong Xiuquan and the Taiping movement as part of his inspiration for reform. Mao looked at Hong as an inspiration because many of the goals Hong wanted to achieve, such as land reform, social reform, and the elimination of classes, all directly were important to Mao. Mao didn't think there needed to be a religious community to support such reforms, but he did believe that Hong was on the right track. For Mao, Hong gave an enlightened example of how to lead a downtrodden caste of people from all walks of society to show them a better way forward. Hong attracted the poor, the displaced, and the disadvantaged, just like Mao envisioned he would do. Now, hopefully this video was enlightening, and for all those who would like to read some more on the subject, I would strongly recommend an excellent book titled Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom by Stephen R. Platt. This book's subtitle says it all: China, the West, and the Epic Story of the Taiping Civil War. Thank you, and that's all for today. Have a great day.